Hey guys, this is Rob at Up Next MMA. Today we're getting into part two of top bromances turned rivalries. Now, if you haven't watched part one, please go to the description below. There's a link to that video. Please check that out. In that video, we talked about, in my opinion, which was the most heated one to date, which is TJ and Cody from Team Alpha Male. Uh, that's that's a that's a crazy one. So definitely check that out, as well as Tyron and Colby. We discussed that in the last video, and we're in this video we're going to get into some of the older ones. So feel free to tune in and let's get into it. All right. Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Now, this one is a throwback, but has to be probably one of the most famous bromances turned rivalries ever. Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz were training partners and friends for most of the late 90s into the early 2000s. Both fighters fought at light heavyweight, and both used to be managed by Dana White. Obviously, until Dana took over as president of the UFC when the Fertittas bought the company. Of course, things changed when Tito wins the title and becomes the UFC's biggest star. Now, Chuck was right behind him in terms of wins over high caliber opponents. So naturally, Chuck starts campaigning for a title shot. The UFC wants to make this fight, given that it'd be a marquee matchup between the companies or two of the company's biggest stars. Tito was hesitant to put pen to paper though. Over the years, his reasons for why have shifted a little bit, but at the time he said he did not want to fight his friend and he had several scheduling conflicts. In years since, he revealed holding off on signing the contract as a tactic to get paid more money by the UFC for the marquee matchup of him and Chuck. Either way, this made Tito look pretty bad. It made him look like as if he was ducking Chuck Liddell. Now the UFC and Chuck used that narrative and played it up in the media to put more pressure on Tito to take the fight. Now Tito didn't budge, so the UFC made a decision to create an interim UFC light heavyweight title fight between Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture. And this was used as, another method to put pressure on Tito. So the rivalry now becomes as much about Tito's beef with the UFC as well as his beef with Chuck. Tito took the interim title fight as a personal slight from the UFC, and he would go on to insult Dana, Chuck, and Randy in the media as much as he could. Now, the UFC is hoping that Chuck wins the interim belt and then they can set up a huge fight between Chuck and Tito. But as Kamaru Usman did with the Kobe versus Tyron fight, Randy spoils the UFC's plans. He used his wrestling and grappling skills to completely neutralize Chuck's striking, and goes on to stop Chuck in the third round due to strikes from the mount position. Randy then goes on to fight Tito Ortiz in a unification bout, and beats him in a dominant decision win. Very reminiscent of what Kamaru Usman did to the Kobe and Tyron matchup, but only this took place earlier. Now, Chuck and Tito are both still high championship, they're championship contenders and they're high up on the list. Now, the relationship between the two now is not great. Chuck tells the media that Tito's still reluctant to fight him, while Tito is taking full aim at Dana and the UFC. He's also calling Chuck a shill for the company, that he just goes with the flow and does whatever they say. Now, Tito has lost the belt and the majority of his negotiating power with the UFC, so they force his hand and they book a fight between him and Chuck Liddell for the number one contender spot for the light heavyweight title. Chuck goes on to knock out Tito in the second round, but their beef is not squashed after that fight. They continue to jaw at each other for the next few years. In that time, Chuck defeats Randy Couture in a rematch and wins the light heavyweight title, and goes on to defend that title multiple times. After Tito's loss to Chuck, he wins 5 consecutive fights, beating Patrick Cote, Forrest Griffin, Vitor Belfort, and Ken Shamrock twice. Tito and Chuck met again at UFC 66 in December of 2006 in a long-awaited grudge match. A rematch, obviously, from their first fight from UFC 47, I think it was. Of which there was, in this grudge match, there was also plenty of trash talk. Tito once again taking aim at the UFC for their poor treatment of him and disrespect, and calling Chuck a poster boy for Dana. Chuck honestly was pretty professional about the whole thing, but he just called Tito a crybaby and a drama queen, and he saw fighting as a business, but he vowed to shut Tito up in their fight. Chuck would go on to win their rematch by TKO in the third round. But their feud did simmer down for a few years afterward. However, Tito's feud with Dana in the UFC raged on for a few more years. Really, that didn't simmer down until he left the company in 2012. Now, Chuck and Tito did fight again in 2018 for Golden Boy Promotions, and Tito did win by knockout, but both of these fighters were well past their primes at that point, and, a lot of us didn't really take that fight seriously. I saw it as a money grab, but, they still have a little animosity between each other, but for them, it's not nearly as bad as it was in years prior. But that to me, the Tito Chuck rivalry is one of the all time most classic friends turned rivals storylines. And it's an ultimate classic because the fights were great, the whole narrative and round robin between Dana, Randy Couture, Chuck, Tito. It's MMA history. And for you new guys, you should go back and watch those fights because they were great. But anyway, on to the next bromance turned rivalry. Our next one, Rashad Evans and John Jones. Now, I covered this briefly before in another video, but many of you do know the background here, but some of you don't. Jones and Rashad were once training partners over at Jackson Wink in New Mexico. Rashad was one of their first students way back after he won the season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter. Jones came in a few years later after he had joined the UFC. Rashad was kind of a mentor to Jones, and they'd become great friends. They vowed never to fight each other until they both found each other on opposite ends of the cage. Now, this rivalry has largely gone overlooked over the years, or kind of forgotten about. I think it's due to Jones's myriad of issues he's had outside the octagon, as well as his ever so famous feud with Daniel Cormier. John Jones has just been through so much over the past 5 or 6 years that maybe we lose track. Maybe we forget about some of the things that happened before we started to slide off a little bit. But also, this feud was a while ago. It mostly took place in 2011, 2012. So, it's been quite some time. But people forget that Rashad Evans was either the light heavyweight champion or the number one contender while Jones was on his way up or fighting his way up the division and on his way to superstardom. The only reason John Jones got the title shot against Shogun at UFC 128 was because Rashad got injured. Jones took his place at UFC 128 and won the title. This put Greg Jackson, their lead coach, in a tough position because he vowed never to get in between or choose between the two. But that changed when Jones won the belt. Jones was clearly the future, and while many believed Rashad had peaked it was just a matter of, you know, John's going places and we should get on this train. Many saw him as a transcendent talent, and the UFC saw him as that too. The UFC began to put all their promotional efforts behind Jones. So, John Jones and Rashad's relationship quickly deteriorated. As Rashad's relationship with Dana in the UFC, Rashad felt betrayed by both parties and took aim at them in the media. Rashad believed that he had been treated unfairly, believing that the UFC and Greg Jackson only cared about money, which is why they backed John Jones, even though Jones had a history of being a wild card outside the cage. And this is back in 2011, 2012, by the way. This is before all the hit and runs and the USADA stuff. John Jones had a reputation of being a wild card even back then. Just to put that in context, John Jones largely tried to avoid the matter in public and in front of the media, but he did address it on a few occasions, only to say that he would fight Rashad if the UFC asked him to, and that his relationship with Rashad, it is what it is. That he'll do what he has to do, and fighting is a business. Now, they eventually did fight at UFC 145, where John Jones would pretty much put a beating on Rashad. Rashad did hit him with some good shots during the fight, and it was competitive, but I mean, Rashad lost a clear unanimous decision to John Jones. And the rivalry after that kind of simmered down a little bit, but the two actually didn't recently patch it up until about a year or two ago when Rashad was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Now, nowadays they both hold each other in high praise and speak very kindly of each other. And I don't think they'll ever be quite as good of friends as they were before, but their relationship is respectful and they're on good terms. I mean, that's more you can say than the other guys on this list. All the other guys on this list still kind of don't like each other even till this day. So it's good to see that John Jones and Rashad have kind of patched things up a little bit and showing some maturity, and to show that fighters can grow past some of these rivalries.